Theatreland, London's West End. 1 square mile of musical talent worth over £250 million a year. One of the cultural epicentres of Great Britain and the world. But it wasn't always this way. 65 years ago, the West End was parochial, trapped in a time warp of pre-war nostalgia, completely unprepared for a new breed of musical emerging from America. This is the story of the rise of the British musical. How the British fought back against American domination to not only reclaim the West End, but to become a driving force behind musical theatre around the world, turning it into a global industry worth over £1.5 billion a year. It's a tale of titanic shows.
Half of it wasn't written, and the bits that had been written were far too long.
Nobody in our team had done it before, except for me.
This was a sort of a musical phenomenon.
A story of prodigious talent.
All the talent that was being invented were all in Britain.
We just thought, this is working quite well.
And that was the day my life changed forever.
And phenomenal daring.
After the reviews, our box office was shredded.
They got to see some ass.
They took him off screaming. We never saw him again. That's how difficult that show is.
At the end of World War II, the West End musical, cut off from outside influences for 6 long years, was looking tired. The musicals of one-time giants Ivor Novello and Noel Coward, with their polite tales of romance, were feeling as out of date as their Victorian settings. And in 1947, London found itself under a new bombardment, a wave of American musicals, quite different from anything any British audience had ever seen before.
I remember when Oklahoma came over, it had a terrific effect on us.
Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plain.
I was just knocked out, absolutely knocked out, breathless.
When the wind comes right behind the rain.
It was just wallop on, you know, Oklahoma, and you, wow, and the energy of it sort of took your breath away.
It was the first time after the sort of dreary years of what was going on in the war where a vibrant new musical had opened in London, and it was a burst of sunshine.
And when we say, no, I ain't we're only saying you're doing fine, Oklahoma, Oklahoma, okay.
In its choreography, lighting, even its cowboy setting, Oklahoma was light years away from what the British were doing. But its most revolutionary aspect was the way it seamlessly stitched dance, song and dialogue into a dramatic whole.
The dances and the songs were all part of the show, which was unusual. In the old days, the songs just came in for no reason at all, but it was all a whole, you know, integrated.
The Americans had arrived. Powerhouses like Rodgers and Hammerstein, Irving Berlin and Lerner and Loewe.
The Americans had so many great writers in full swing. They just came one after the other, you know. It was marvelous.
The Americans were in the ascendance. Unable to rival them, British composers came up with breezier, small-scale musicals like Salad Days and The Boyfriend. Curiosities, quite different from the loud, flashy shows coming from Broadway.
I never felt that I could really write that sort of show. And in fact, the writing The Boyfriend was in direct contrast. It was very old-fashioned. It was an old-fashioned 1920s musical.
We've got to have, for it's so dreary not to have that sad thing called the boyfriend.
The boyfriend's story of love on the French Riviera was inspired by the dance crazes of the Roaring Twenties. With Britain in the grip of a revival of those happier pre-war years, The Boyfriend became a rare British musical success.
I think it was the timing was right. We'd had so many American musicals, and then suddenly The Boyfriend, it was so simple, and it was not sophisticated at all, and the music was pretty, the lyrics were lovely.
I could be happy with you if you could be happy with me.
It was thrilling, really, because somehow in my childhood I'd always imagined that I would write a musical comedy that would be a hit on the West End, and it actually happened with the first show I wrote.
The Boyfriend's use of 1920s American dance music made it an appealing prospect to Broadway producers. In 1954, it became the first post-war musical to go against the tide and transfer to New York.
I drank Manhattans, I ate hamburgers, I went to Macy's and Bloomingdale's. That was the culture for me. It was like in Aladdin's cave, to tell the truth, coming from not war-torn Britain, but we were a bit deprived here.
The American producers on Broadway were Cy Feuer and Ernie Martin. Showman, whose latest blockbuster, Guys and Dolls, was an altogether more show-busy affair than the intimate period piece that was The Boyfriend.
They were very charming to begin with, but not for long. They were brutes. They were determined to make it a hit, come what may. They suddenly turned on us and said, "Get out." In fact, I was literally picked up and flung out onto the sidewalk, yeah. And we weren't allowed in at all until the first night. And by that time, they had done a lot of damage. They turned it into a burlesque.
Only by hamming up The Boyfriend for cheap laughs did the American producers believe it could be a Broadway hit. If the British were ever to find success in America on their own terms, a radical rethink in musical theatre would have to happen. By the late 1950s, the seeds of that revolution were beginning to be sown. Not in West End's theatre land, but in the socially deprived East End and the politically radical Stratford East Theatre Workshop.
At present, the company are working on a new musical about the Soho underworld, under their director, Joan Littlewood.
Joan Littlewood was probably the most important theatre director in Britain in the second half of the 20th century. She sort of reinvented theatre. She got completely fed up of this notion that theatre was posh people.
She allowed you to be yourself. I mean, I was a working class, lower class girl, and I was forced to be middle class by the theatre of the day, because that's what you did. You spoke nice, and you looked pretty, and you weren't tall, so I always wore flat shoes, and, you know, you conformed. And Joan suddenly threw all that aside.
Hunters come in here, they expect to have a card game, and what happens? They look around, what do they see? You and your bleeding birds and him lying about all over the place. So they have it off to that bleeding French who's down the road.
She actually directed shows in a way that they'd never been directed before. She improvised scenes with the actors. Scripts were built up through the process of improvisation with actors.
Everybody threw in their two penneth. And she always had music in her plays because it seemed right and proper that people would burst into song. So I don't think she distinguished between a musical and a play. She was a total original, Joan.
While Littlewood was transforming theatre, a revolution was happening in the world of popular music. Rock and roll was the sound of a new generation, and a young East End Jewish songwriter named Lionel Bart was making a name for himself, penning hits for the likes of Cliff Richard and Tommy Steele.
I met him about 2 o'clock in the morning at a party that I'd been invited to in a bombed ruin next door to Waterloo Station. And there was this fella wearing a big picture hat a big feather boa and one of those oil lamps, swinging it around his head, singing There Ain't Nothing Like a Dame. And it was Lionel. Crazy, mad, absolutely potty, but brilliant.
In 1959, Joan Littlewood asked Bart to add music and lyrics to Things Ain't What They Used to Be, a comedy about the Soho criminal underworld. The meeting of two mavericks would have lasting consequences for the British musical.
Lionel loved working on his feet and he loved working with other people. Joan would say, we need another song here. What about this guy comes on? OK. And he'd go away. And he loved that show-off thing of being able, hey, there's the song. And it was brilliant.
Fing's story of bent coppers, spivs and prostitutes became a surprise hit. Publicity was helped with a spin-off single by Max Bygraves.
They've changed our local pally into a bowling alley, and things ain't what they used to be.
Now, if you listen to that, you get no indication at all of what the show is about because the words were completely rewritten. The original words for Things are entirely different from the Max Bygraves version, and the BBC could not in a million years play it.
There's toffs with toffee noses and puffs in coffee houses, and things ain't what they used to be. There's short-time, low-price mysteries without proper histories. Things ain't what they used to be. And he says, how they used to be class, doing a town, buying a bit of vice. She says, and that's when a brass couldn't go down. Under the union price, not likely, once in golden days of yore. Ponce's killed a lazy whore. Things ain't what they used to be. You want a second chorus?
With its subject matter and language, Things was a direct challenge to the office of the Lord Chamberlain, which for over 200 years had been the country's official theatre censor.
The interior decorator, Wallace Eaton, carrying a ladder. The censorship man said that you mustn't carry the ladder in a sort of semi-vertical position because that's suggestive.
The night he came in, it was carried at an erotic angle, and he wasn't standing for that. He wanted a lot of the words taken out. Nobody took any notice of him at all because the show was improvised, semi-improvised, so they just make up new stuff.
With Things, the British musical seemed to be finding its feet. But the Americans had already unleashed yet another game-changing blockbuster.
Overriding the whole of the musical theatre from the late 50s to the early 60s was West Side Story, which was just such an overpowering achievement. Everybody just watched it with open mouths and said, how the hell do you do that?
West Side Story's update of Romeo and Juliet using rival ethnic street gangs left audiences shocked. Never before had a musical attempted such adult themes and tied it together with a bristling soundtrack and electrifying choreography.
And no one knew what to do. The musical had come to a stop, killed by genius. Bernstein's genius stopped them knowing where they were going to go next. So along comes Lionel Bart, an ordinary Cockney boy from the East End with salt beef and a pickle, and he goes back to his Cockney roots.
What Lionel did, instead of trying to leap over the bar, he limboed under it and came in with this Dickens story that had British tunes in it. He didn't try and do that American jazzy stuff to equal West Side Story. He did these knees up. You know, you cannot listen to Oliver without doing that. Consider yourself.
Consider yourself at home. Consider yourself one of the family.
Like Bernstein, Bart had written a musical about street gangs, but this was a very British story set in the seedy underbelly of Dickens' London.
Well,
Much of the success of the show would depend on how well Fagin, the evil gang leader of the novel, could be turned into a more sympathetic figure for the West End stage. Auditioning for the part was actor Ron Moody.
For the first audition, they said, now what about singing? So I said, well, I can do Nessun dorma, nessun dorma, tu pure o principessa, nella tua franca stangio, parto li poo-poo, etc., etc. Terrible, eh?
He got the part and he invented the part. I mean, there's no going away from that everybody who's ever played Fagin since, there is always that reference point that you are referring to Ron Moody.
When I see someone rich, both my thumbs start to itch. Only to find some peace of mind, I have to pick a pocket or two. You gotta pick a pocket or two.
You got to pick a pocket or two.
Even with the brilliance of Moody as Fagin, at its stage premiere in June 1960, Bart wasn't convinced that Oliver could be a success.
Lionel Bart was so convinced that it was a flop that he went down the road to Barbara Windsor's dressing room, where he spent most of the show because Things Ain't What They Used to Be was on there, and came back and heard this braying noise and thought he was being booed.
Donald Aubrey, who was the producer, was, "Where the hell have you been? Come with me." And they basically pushed him on stage. By this time, they'd taken 23 curtain calls, not just curtain calls, but reprises of Consider Yourself. They'd sung that song 23 times. The cast were hoarse. The audience wasn't going to go home.
And woof, that was it. He was the master, suddenly. It wasn't just Lionel Bart anymore, he was a big thing.
Oliver, Oliver, never before has a boy wanted more.
What made Bart's success all the more extraordinary was that he couldn't actually read or write music.
He was full of ideas, but nothing was, didn't hand you a piece of paper saying that, there's the plan. And so the tunes came to him. Da-da-da-da-da, da-da. And yeah, it's a little tune. Somebody would write it down.
Is this E flat, you see?
I'll see you again.
I always think it must be very difficult to write both words and music, if only because you haven't got somebody else telling you where you're going wrong. So Lionel Bart was a significant talent. He really was.
Either your piano is out of tune, or you've got clothed ears, mate.
You see, that's why his talent went through him like that, because he didn't think, well, what did I have to do with it? All I did was invent the tunes, but they were marvellous.
Who's glorious food? What is there more handsome?
3 years after its London premiere, Oliver launched on Broadway to critical and commercial acclaim. Britain finally had a genuine international hit, free from American meddling. It was the start of a boom time for Brits on Broadway, and Bart was at its head.
Just over the road from where Oliver opened, Peter Cook, Dudley Moore, Alan Bennett and Jonathan Miller were appearing in Beyond the Fringe. Just down the road, a few blocks away, Tony Newley was in Stop the World, I Want to Get Off. These shows were hits. More significant still, when Oliver opened, #1 in the American hit parade was Telstar by the Tornadoes.
A British invasion which has been going on since last autumn. The invasion of Broadway.
So this notion that the Beatles brought Britain to America, bollocks. Lionel did it. Lionel and Tony Newley and Joe Meek and the Tornadoes, they made that British Revolution happen. And so Oliver's Britishness was what the Americans loved.
If I ruled the world,
Musicals were no longer seen as dreary and old-fashioned. They were suddenly the bright new thing, and everybody wanted to be part of it, including Lionel Bart's former bandmate and Britain's most famous pop star, Tommy Steele.
I was an English Elvis Presley. But the problem with me was, and it's not a problem, is that I wanted to be in musicals.
When I first met him, I was like, blah, 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 blah. And of course, I'm only a teenager, you've got to remember. So for me, he was like a huge star.
You got to sing the blues.
By 1963, the British musical was on such a wave of popularity that a show was written as a star vehicle for Steele. But even for such a seasoned performer, the transition from pop performer to stage performer was a daunting experience.
I do remember the first night when I walked on stage, because I had to walk on stage facing Tommy, and I sort of saw out the corner of my eye, all these heads go vroom, like this, all of them turned towards me, and I thought, oh my God.
You're in the dark and the show's going on and your cue's coming up and the music is just coming into the last 24 bars, and you know in 23, 22, 21, that bloody light's going to hit the corner and I'm going to have to walk into it.
And I was so scared, and I looked at Tommy and he was shaking. I thought, oh, thank God he's scared like me.
Oh, here it comes, but oh, I'm all right now.
And though that half a sixpence can only mean half a romance, remember that half a romance is better than none.
Half a Sixpence told the story of an orphan who unexpectedly inherits a fortune. But if this was to be the musical to launch a pop star's switch to the stage, it would need a standout number. Just 2 days before opening, the producers realised that was exactly what was missing.
Unless you've got an 11 o'clock number that sends the folks out to their buses and their trains whistling it, you're in trouble. You have not got a hit.
Composer David Henniker had just 1 day to come up with a solution.
And on the Sunday we met and they played Flashbang Wallop.
Hello, did Flashbang Wallop, what a picture, what a picture, what a photograph.
And because we didn't have time to work out what I would be doing in the number, they decided that we'd bring all the company on, and every time I said hold it, they froze. So we made it in the photographer's studio.
Stick it in your family album.
It became the biggest hit of the season.
One more picture, hold it, the same thing.
With a big closing number and the star power of Steele, Half a Sixpence became a huge success in the West End and on Broadway. But the British musical's revival was to be short-lived. Half a Sixpence would be the last British musical export to America for 15 years.
Stick it in your family, stick it in your family, in your family album.
A world away from the glamour of Broadway, in mid-60s Britain, an alternative movement was growing. Tens of thousands marched against nuclear weapons, and over in London's East End, Joan Littlewood reflected these anti-establishment views with a scathing attack on the military incompetence of World War I.
Oh, What a Lovely War was inspirational. To have a musical about a subject like that, you know, I mean, it was quite controversial because it wasn't patriotic by any manner of means, it was telling the truth.
With its soundtrack of World War I songs, Oh, What a Lovely War not only attacked the generals, but also outraged many in the audience by depicting soldiers as Pierrot clowns.
People would scrunch their programs up and throw it at us in disgust. How dare you! And, oh, my family were killed in that war, and you're dancing on the graves. People accuse us of dancing on the graves of the soldiers. As Joan said, no, we're dancing with them.
Pack up your troubles in your own kit bag and smile, smile, smile.
I mean, it was an extraordinary approach to a subject that gutted you, and it was deeply moving, deeply moving. And she managed to get that combination of comedy, song, dance, everything, and hit you with it.
While Littlewood went on to win awards for Oh What a Lovely War, Lionel Bart had found more success with the musicals Blitz and Maggie May. So when the two joined up in 1965 for a musical based on the legend of Robin Hood, it looked destined to become Britain's biggest hit musical yet, particularly when backed by a record-breaking budget of £130,000.
There he goes again on his merry way.
But problems plagued the production from day one.
Backstage, it's been toil and trouble almost right from the start. And the cast of Twang have had the longest run ever before actually getting in front of a London audience.
Joan had a sort of free and easy style, out of which she hoped to draw spontaneity and fresh ideas, and, but it wasn't quite buttoned down enough for me.
How much rewriting has been done at it?
Absolutely everything. I don't do anything the same.
Things ran out of control, really. I mean, people, making up all sorts of rubbishy little scenes.
One day, one particular scene is in one spot, and then the next day it's in another spot. Do you see what I mean? And then one day, 4 scenes are cut out.
If you had a good little part and a good little moment, you were advised not to go to the lavatory, otherwise when you came back, somebody had either taken it over or it had gone entirely, been erased.
Whole scenes were dumped. Some parts were cut down to a fragment, other parts expanded.
Barbara Windsor, among others, suggests that a lot of dope was being smoked at the time, that Lionel, a year ahead of the Beatles, might have done acid by then. So there was, a drug put into the cocktail.
The creative chemistry that was set up for the original production did not mix, it exploded.
Twang was due to open in Manchester before transferring to the West End, but just one day before press night, Littlewood finally had enough and left the production.
She was seen walking out with a beige folder on her arm, and written in big pencil on the outside was Lionel's final fuck-up. And so that must have been what she thought at the time.
She said I had to leave because Lionel became impossible. Every day there was some other new thing he wanted to do. By that time, ego, bigger than his hat.
There were 2 different methods of approach. Joan Littlewood was doing a commedia dell'arte, grow while you work thing on the scenes, and I was doing songs elsewhere, and her scenes changed every day, and I just had to keep up with her. Consequently, when we opened in Manchester, the audience and I saw a number of the scenes for the first time.
What makes a star into a star? Nobody knows. They simply are.
Even with more extensive rewrites, on its West End opening in December 1965, Twang was universally panned. After playing to mostly empty houses, it closed 1 month later after just 43 performances.
I wonder if it was the saddest time in Lionel's life. I think I'm right in saying he pumped a lot of his personal money into it to try and keep it, keep it going.
Remember Oliver, Maggie May, and Things Ain't What They Used to Be? Well, for Lionel Bart today, things definitely ain't. For the man who once earned a fortune from his songwriting is in debt to the tune of £160,000 and is in the process of being declared bankrupt.
Against all advice, he had invested his own personal fortune into Twang and lost it all. He never wrote another successful musical. By the late 60s, Bart's style of pop-influenced Cockney musical appeared hopelessly out of date.
This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, the age of Aquarius.
Yet another American blockbuster had landed in the West End, which not only challenged the conventions of musical theatre, but the power of the British establishment. And its inspiration came from Bart's one-time collaborator.
One influence that I've never really mentioned to anybody before was a British musical that came to New York. It was a woman director, Joan Littlewood, and it was a show called Oh, What a Lovely War. And I remember sitting there in the audience and seeing this musical, this wonderful show, wonderfully the way it was staged and the fact that it was singing, and it was all about war. I think that was a strong influence on us because this whole thing was about the movement that was going on in the streets.
We had the Vietnam War on our screens every night. You know, we were very aware of what was going on. And the other thing about Hair was, of course, it celebrated that whole hippie movement, which, of course, had affected this country as well.
I got my hair, I got my head, I got my brains, I got my ears, I got my eyes, I got my nose, I got my mouth, I got my teeth.
Hair told the story of a group of young hippies protesting against the Vietnam War and wrestling with the sexual revolution. The creators' backgrounds were in experimental theatre. Much like Joan Littlewood, the emphasis was on spontaneity and improvisation.
I think Hair, which I was part of as being the runner on the original production, you know, I noticed that even though the entire thing, from the audience perspective, almost seemed improvised, it was improvised to a very, very careful point, and the numbers evolved through workshops and things like that, but they were very, very cleverly staged.
To add to the credibility of the show, the producers cast unknown actors, and in doing so, introduced a new generation of talent to the West End.
I'm just a hairy guy. They were looking for kids off the street rather than trained actors per se. They were looking for actors who could be molded into what they called the tribe.
The audience, at the beginning, when they came to see Hair, I feel they felt that they were actually seeing real hippies on stage.
I never bought into the tribe thing, to be honest with you. I mean, Gary Hamilton playing Burger used to go on stage in all his outfit, you know, his hippie outfit and all that, and peace, love, and then he used to walk out the stage door and climb into a Bentley. And I couldn't quite work that one out. It always made me laugh, that. You know, I didn't live that life. You know, I didn't go home to a squat with 12 other people. I mean, some of them did.
I lived in a commune with several other members of the company, a rather posh commune, I have to say, in Hampstead, in a penthouse, actually.
Oh, black boys are nutritious, baby. Black boys fill me up. Baby. Black boys are so damn yummy. They satisfy my tummy. I am such a sweet when it comes to love.
But at the beginning of 1968, the Lord Chamberlain still had right of censorship over all new theatre productions. With overt references to sex and drugs, Hair was one show he wouldn't let go on.
I had a visit from the special branch, and they warned me what risk I was taking by opening it, probably to intimidate me. I don't think they would have come to my office otherwise.
The pressure on the government to reform the powers of the censor became overwhelming. On September the 24th, after 220 years, the Lord Chamberlain's powers were finally withdrawn.
Hair really contributed to the change of the law. It would be on the news day in, day out what was happening.
3 days after the censor was abolished, Hair opened. And the British public had never seen anything like it before.
Are you all in the nude scene?
It was just an expression of people just taking their clothes off and saying, this is who we are. And you can read into that what you like. Some people probably found it moving, other people probably found, you know, they got turned on by it. But ultimately, it was very innocent.
There was much to do about nothing. except for selling tickets.
For the first time in a musical, frequent references were made to recreational drug use. The experimentation with illegal substances continued offstage.
We all dabbled a bit in marijuana, obviously, and some of the cast smoked a little bit more than others.
I mean, you know, I was a nice suburban girl, me, from Barnet, and I never thought that I would ever, I'm really giving it away now, aren't I, ever, you know, try a spliff.
I'm sure that the odd person went on the stage stoned, but it wasn't a good idea because you found yourself just standing there looking at people. You know, and they're going, well, OK, you've got something to say now, and you're going, yeah. What?
People would pop up on the interval onto the roof of the Shaftesbury Theatre for a quick, you know, tote. In fact, I'm ashamed to admit, I think I got fired, and that was from Hare eventually, not for smoking dope, but they used the excuse that we'd been caught smoking on the roof.
When the moon is in the seventh house and Jupiter aligns with Mars.
With its subversive stance and contemporary music, Hare reached out and spoke to a generation uninterested in the past conventions of musical theatre.
I think Hare brought a new audience that wouldn't be seen dead on Shaftesbury Avenue. Young people who would never think of the theatre being anything more than a treat for their elderly relatives suddenly wanted to see this show because it actually represented them.
We kind of felt that we were changing the world. The world was changing, and we were reflecting it from the point of view of this very wonderful love and peace movement.
I never thought we were going to change the world. What I thought we were changing was theatre. It was the first time that music of the time, that is to say rock music, was being used within the context of a musical. So from that point of view, it was groundbreaking, I thought.
By the late 60s, British bands like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple and The Who were getting more ambitious with rock music, experimenting with extended tracks and concept albums. In 1970, in what would prove to be the most radical evolution of the British musical yet, two aspiring young songwriters released a record that fused rock with opera.
Jesus Christ Superstar is the first truly great, truly British rock opera, because it's structured like an opera. Suddenly there was no speaking. This thing is sung all the way through. But it's sung to the rhythms and to the beats of the 60s generation.
David Land is an agent who looks after the Dagenham Girl Pipers and the Harlem Globetrotters. He feels the next big trend could be Jesus Christ Superstar.
Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber would each bring very different qualities to the British musical. While both fans of rock music, lyricist Rice knew next to nothing about musical theatre. Lloyd Webber lived and breathed it.
When we came to work together, I was probably less conventional than he was. He was very much in the Broadway West End tradition. I had ideas that weren't perhaps traditional. So the combination of my being slightly uneducated about musicals and Andrew being very educated about musicals worked.
I don't see why he moves me.
Released in 1970, if the album was a hit, Rice and Lloyd Webber could attract interest from theatre producers and turn Superstar into a fully blown stage musical.
We only released the album because nobody wanted to do the show, and it was not a hit in Britain. And as it had been a #1 album in America, hugely successful, it was logical to do it on Broadway first.
Jesus, you started to believe the things they say of you.
previously introduced sex, nudity and drugs to the theatre, but it seemed setting the final days of Jesus Christ to rock music was a step too far. Superstar opened on Broadway in October 1971 to the outrage of Christian groups and a lukewarm reception from the press.
It didn't work largely because the young kids who'd originally bought the album wouldn't have been seen dead on Broadway in those days. So we were slightly ahead of our time. All right, there'd been Hair before, but Hair probably got people in because everybody got their kit off.
They found the new Messiah.
Even with the shaky start on Broadway, producer Robert Stigwood had plans for an opening in the West End. But Rice and Lloyd Webber saw their careers faltering before they even got started.
Tim and Andrew were terrified. They fought me tooth and nail not to open it. Descended on me at 2 o'clock in the morning. You'll ruin our reputation. You'll ruin us, you'll ruin us.
Everything's all right, yes, everything's fine, and we want you to sleep well tonight.
With producer Robert Stigwood holding the rights, the West End's latest protégés had to put their nerves to one side as press attention in Superstar started to grow.
They did a thing with the newspapers. The search for Jesus is on, a bit like the X Factor, you know, we're looking for Jesus. And finally, after extensive auditions, going back and back and back, I finally got the part. And I was surrounded by press, and I made my very first mistake. Some guy shoved a pint of beer in my hand, right, and said, cheers, right? And the shot in the paper was, Jesus is having a pint. And I thought, oh, never again.
We had nuns protesting with placards outside the theatre, and everybody would say to me, Anthony, that's brilliant, you know, well done for doing all that. They did it off their own back. I wasn't telling them to do it.
The title was so radical, calling Jesus Christ a superstar. I mean, we had people out front protesting just on the basis of the title.
It seemed to me that it was perfectly possible to take Bible stories and tell them in a new way through contemporary music. And that's really all we were trying to do.
Superstar opened in August 1972 to universally good reviews. The radical interpretation of the Gospels moving audience, critics, and even the cast.
It was very overwhelming, because I remember the first time I went up on this cross. Now, I'm not a religious guy at all. And I was sort of sitting on a bicycle seat, but you couldn't see it, and I was holding onto a frame that you also couldn't see. So I looked like I was hanging in midair. And for me, you know, when they started playing that John 49, that Gethsemane music that he'd written, I mean, just tears were streaming down me. And it really was a very, very moving moment. And I guess for a lot of the audience, seeing that and hearing that music for the first time, they would have felt the same way.
With the West End audience seemingly more spiritually relaxed than on Broadway, Superstar appealed to believer and non-believer alike.
This was something that people could relate to. And its producer, Robert Stigwood, created this incredibly ingenious idea, which had never been done before, of replicating the production around the globe.
It was Robert who realised that you had to roll these musicals out very fast. And in fact, he changed the whole way that musical theatre was considered. And I owe a huge debt to him, because it was Robert's gamble and his sort of showmanship that I guess I learned an awful lot from.
I wanna see my God.
Earlier British musicals like Oliver had found success by trading on their Britishness. The story of Jesus Christ was universal. allied with a contemporary soundtrack and modern staging, and its appeal could be limitless. But the rollout wasn't without its complications.
When we put on in Paris, the Archbishop of Paris and the Cardinal were at the first night. I was next to them and Andrew the other side, and Andrew was very unhappy. So he jumped out of his seat and, swearing, effing and blinding. Oh, terrible, terrible. Take this off, take this off. And he ended up running down the aisle, shouting, "This must be stopped, this must be stopped." And I had the embarrassing scene of, in front of the audience, having to pinion him against the corner of the proscenium arch to calm him down.
Andrew was always much more caught up in it. He was, it mattered more to him. I mean, of course it mattered to me, but it's rather hard to explain. But I think the success of Superstar, and indeed Andrew's musical career, mattered enormously to him, which is to his great credit. I think what mattered to me more was that just life went okay, and this was one aspect of it.
After the success of Superstar, Andrew Lloyd Webber returned to more traditional British fare with the P.G. Wodehouse-inspired Jeeves. It flopped, running for just over a month. Meanwhile, Tim Rice had another off-the-wall idea for a musical.
I'd already got this idea about Eva Peron, and so I was working on that for quite a while on my Todd. And while Andrew was doing Jeeves, I did approach one or two other composers to see if they'd be interested, including Paul McCartney, funnily enough. Nobody wanted to know.
Their reluctance was understandable. Most successful musicals were based on well-known books or plays. Evita was the real-life story of a South American dictator's wife. With the failure of Jeeves, Andrew came on board.
Nobody really knew much about Eva Peron when we did the show. And it was clearly a slightly strange topic to go for. But on the other hand, it was a great story, and story is king.
I don't expect my love affairs to last for long.
Just as they had with Superstar, Lloyd Webber and Rice released a concept album first. But this time not out of necessity, but design.
It's a bit like an out-of-town run, really. I think on the whole we'd rather do that than do the out-of-town run, certainly for Evita. And we're, if you like, testing the music. And had the record been a total disaster, then I think we wouldn't have gone ahead with the show.
Another suitcase in another hole.
The album also generated publicity and provided Julie Covington with a #1 hit. An accomplished actress, Covington was the natural choice to play Evita on the stage. But against all expectations, she turned the part down.
Well, Julie just didn't want to do it. And we thought, oh my gosh, if she doesn't do it, this could be a major blow to the show. But it was the best thing that happened in a way. Not because, I mean, she probably would have been great, but it was great because there was a kind of nationwide search.
The audition period for me for Evita was long and tedious. I must have auditioned 8, 9, I don't know, 10 times. Everybody, the world and his wife, auditioned for this role.
Every day, ladies were photographed going in for the auditions.
Faye Dunaway, Liza Minnelli, Barbara Streisand, all these names were being bandied about.
Several of them announced that they turned it down. It got down eventually to about half a dozen possibles, of which Elaine was one.
My doorbell went at about midnight, and to my surprise, it was my agent. The role of, yes, get on with it, Libby. Eva Peron is, yes, just tell me, yours. I was so stunned and excited and shocked. Here I was with the most coveted role in musical theatre for donkey's years, since the casting of Vivien Leigh in Gone with the Wind, and I'd landed the role. Nobody could have been more gobsmacked than me and my dear mother, who was staying with me for the weekend. And that was the day my life changed forever.
Don't cry for me, Argentina. The truth is, I never left you.
Tim and Andrew could afford to entrust the starring role to an unknown because they'd already hired the world's greatest living musical theatre director, Hal Prince.
The musical in Britain has been really very much straitjacketed by the fact we don't have any decent directors and choreographers, and we're here working with the marvellous Hal Prince. And I think that we have been able, therefore, to take a subject and tackle it in a way that is not normally done, either actually in American theatre or in British theatre, because there's a sort of slight combination of the injection of what Hal has been able to give to us, and I think perhaps what we've been able to give back.
I knew the first time we put it together that it was something fresh and new and enormously electrifying. I felt that. I felt that when I did West Side Story, which I produced. That kind of, just something amazing is happening here because a lot of people took a chance.
If you're looking down, it's
Hal was renowned for bringing realism to acting and singing in musical theatre. Exactly what was needed for Andrew and Tim's story of ruthless political ambition.
We could all be there if we all had the drive that I have, and we must all have the drive that I have, and then you'll have these gowns, you'll have these jewels. You'll be where I am.
I never forget Hal directing me when it came to singing Argentina. And he would say to me, no, don't forget, this is not, you know, some beautiful ballad. I don't want you to be worrying about the melody and singing it prettily. He said, you have to remember that this is really a political speech.
I'm going to make it hard. I'm going to make it less easy.
One of the most brilliant pieces of direction he gave me was to lock my eyes onto various members of the audience. And he said, and look at them, and don't be afraid to really give them the eyeball, you know.
Okay, here we go. Good.
You'll think it's strange when I try to explain how I feel, that I still need your love after all that I've done.
And to this day, every single time I ever sing this song, I think of that note, and I always do it. And it's quite extraordinary how off-putting it is for the person that I look at.
Don't cry for me, Argentina.
6 years after the premiere of Jesus Christ Superstar, Evita opened in June 1978 to advance ticket sales of £250,000, establishing Rice and Lloyd Webber as far more than one-hit wonders.
Evita as a piece, as a theatrical musical, was probably our peak, just because we all kind of knew what we were doing, and we were still young enough to be a bit off the wall, and yet we were old enough and experienced enough to do it well. With Superstar, we hadn't a clue what we were doing.
She did so well, the audience gave her and the show a standing ovation, and the critics hailed a new star. Hardly anyone seemed happier with it all than Elaine's mother and father, up from Bognor Regis to share their daughter's triumph after 10 years in chorus lines and rep.
Could you go right?
Marvellous. I thought she was terrific. Absolutely marvellous.
It's one of those moments, every so often a musical comes along which pushes what the musical can achieve further than anyone had imagined could happen. And what Evita did was it caught what fascinates us all about politics. What we really care about, I think, is a soap opera of power and what that means for us. What does it say about the human condition? And that is exactly what Lloyd Webber and Rice caught in Evita.
High flying adored, did you believe?
A year later, Evita opened on Broadway for a 4-year run, cementing Lloyd Webber and Rice as not just stars of the West End, but also the first British talent to triumph in New York for 15 years. They had the world at their feet.
I don't think at the time we were aware of history or our place in it. We just thought, this is working quite well. I'm not quite sure what we're doing right, but let's keep going.
But as the 70s came to a close, the unimaginable happened. At the height of their songwriting powers, the partnership came to an end.
Well, it was a sadness that they stopped working together because they were kind of becoming the Rodgers and Hammerstein of modern British musical theatre. They were really consolidating their writing partnership. Sadly, it was over a musical that was in the workings, in the making for me. Tim wanted to write a musical for me, and Andrew had started writing melodies for it. And Tim, at the time, you know, he's a great cricket fan, as everybody knows, and quite slow in writing lyrics. Not everybody knows, but Andrew knew. So he wasn't coming up with the lyrics for Andrew.
I guess my heart wasn't quite in it. We did write one song, and it never really took off. And suddenly I found Andrew was doing it with Don Black.
Take that look off your face.
Tell Me on a Sunday launched as a TV special in February 1980. It was a new decade, and Andrew had a new writing partner.
The story goes that Andrew bumped into Don Black, and Don, who is prolific, said, "Oh, I'll write you a few lyrics if you want," which he did. So the idea moved from working with Tim to Don, and I think they had a bit of a bust-up over it, to be honest. As I remember it, they fell out over that. And that's really when it all kind of came to a bit of a grinding halt, their partnership.
I think at the time I thought, this is a pity, really. We kind of cocked this one up. We've done quite well, and no, we're not going to be Gilbert and Sullivan. What you need for two people to work together is both of them have to be enthusiastic about the same idea. I mean, Andrew always said, oh, well, he only works on his own ideas. Well, to a certain extent, that's true, I suppose. But if Andrew came up with an idea that I thought was brilliant, I might have done it. I probably would have done it.
Rice and Lloyd Webber's partnership was over. But together they had helped bring the West End and the British musical back into contention with the might of Broadway. Next time on The Story of the Musical, how in less than a decade the British turned the West End show into a world-beating mega-musical.
We happen to all want to do stories which had a worldwide appeal. None of us knew that up front.
You've got to do it yourself. You were a producer. That's what you do. You've got to produce it yourself.
These checks started hitting the doormat that made my eyes wobble.